Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Family Twist. And today we're diving into part 2 of our conversation with David. If you haven't had a chance to listen to part 1, be sure to check that out first. It's an incredible journey of self-discovery, resilience, and healing. In this episode, we're going even deeper into David's story as he shares more about his journey with addiction, the role of his adoption experience, and the healing process that followed. We're so grateful to have David back with us to continue sharing his powerful story.
The progressive nature of my addiction to alcohol made my life tougher and tougher. It affected negatively my relationships. It affected very negatively my health. I had 2 grand mal seizures in that process, likely due to alcohol, although they were never diagnosed. And I certainly had a huge hit to any self-esteem that I had to begin with, right? I just had none by the time any of it was done, and I had no confidence that I knew how to navigate life. And they talk about hitting a rock bottom. It's not all it's cracked up to be, but I did. Thankfully, it got me motivated. I sought treatment, and I had extensive treatment. I had to detoxify in an emergency room in a hospital. I had to go to inpatient residential treatment. I had to do outpatient treatment, and I got involved in some support group fellowships that I still have some involvement in today that helped me stabilize my life and look at these things. So for that first year after having stopped drinking, it was all about not returning to those stressors or learning how to process stressors in healthy ways, looking for ways to cope, right? After a year, I realized, wait a minute, I was adopted as a kid. I wonder if that has anything to do with the way I've approached life, the way I've self-medicated. And at that time, I started an investigation as to the causes and conditions. What did I do? When did I do it? And what does that look like now? And ultimately, it led to a really bleak observation that, wait a minute, I don't even know who I am. How could I even assess this? I don't know who I am. All of those were coping strategies, right? Those were all adaptive strategies for a perceived very threatening life that I was living. Now that I'm not threatened as much anymore, what's in there? What's in there, and what do I have to do? So ultimately, my story of healing and success has been realizing that, believing in my heart that there is a connection between that relinquishment experience, that adoption experience, and my unhealthy use of chemicals and alcohol and nicotine in particular as unhealthy coping mechanisms, and removing those coping mechanisms and having to go back and try to learn them all over again. We hear sometimes in society that people who start using chemicals addictively stop in their growth at that point in time, right? So if someone starts using chemicals at 13, they stop in their growth. And I always used to thought that was just anecdotal. It was just a threatening way to say, don't start using early, right? It's really dangerous. But ultimately, that's what happens, right? If I'm turning to a coping mechanism at age 13 instead of developing them, once I stop using the coping mechanism, I have to find new ones. And so I spent a good number of years developing healthy coping mechanisms, including that blue mind science and meditation and some other things that I have done throughout the years. So ultimately, that's my story. And guess what? As I've gone out into the world, I'm not the only one who has had these experiences, right? I've learned that others have perceived themselves to have some type of intersection between that early childhood adversity, including relinquishment and adoption, and unhealthy behaviors later on, whether those involve chemicals, whether they were behavioral in terms of gambling or being overly sexual or spending too much money or whatever they look like. Because I can't really go back to age 13 and say, this is what I was thinking at age 13. It's impossible. The brain doesn't work that way. It doesn't play a movie. The brain processes things and turns them into perception. So I had to go back and dig pretty deep and figure out, okay, when I'm telling you this and I know this, I'm pretty sure about this. I can never 100% know that's what happened, but it sure makes a lot of sense. It sure explains a lot of things that I ordinarily couldn't explain before. And once I learned what those were, I had an area that I could focus on and that I could apply solutions to.
Mm. Well, my next question was going to be, how in 30 years did it not dawn on you at one point that maybe this has something to do with adoption? But as you said, you were mentally stunted from age 13 because you were in puberty. Your brain was not fully developed yet. And
absolutely. And I can't answer that question in a way because, as you can imagine, or maybe you've heard other people who have struggled with these types of behaviors have said before, I didn't really think I had a problem. I just thought I had more gusto for life. I just thought I partied more. I just thought I had more friends. I just thought I had more opportunities to engage in that coping mechanism that I hadn't yet called a coping mechanism. So it took me a long time to realize hey, this is a problem. This is really unhealthy.
Yeah.
Then to go and try to get to the root causes, in that thinking, as you said, in a clouded mind that isn't thinking very carefully or doesn't really understand reality for what it is, you've got to clear the mind of all the chemicals, take some time, stabilize, and then think, okay, where do we need to go here? So that's part of that process that you've.
And we've only recently started to realize in the community, adoptive parents are starting to get more educated about these sorts of things. Because for decades, I'm sure, not that they were seeing themselves as saviors, but that was the thing, like, oh, we saved this child. And you described your upbringing as happy and prosperous, but nobody recognized that this was going on with you from age 13?
Exactly. Now, I got married at a relatively young age. Given today's thing, I was 24. Over time, my wife voiced some concerns about it. She was also very vocal about wanting to support me in finding out my genetic roots, right? Especially when we had children. Hey, David, I respect you. I understand why you might have some resentments. I understand why you don't want to delve into that, but we have children now. Don't we owe them the information to find out if they're genetically predisposed to anything that they should be watching for? It took me a long time of being, I say beaten over the head, but my wife has never done that. She's very loving and very assuring and very supportive. It took me a long time to realize that was absolutely true. It wasn't as though I denied that. I agreed with her in the beginning. It was, oh my gosh, now I have to do something that seems so dark to me. And if I go there, I don't know if I'm coming back. And it took me a while to build that, I guess, belief and motivation would be appropriate ways to describe that. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I'm going to assume at some point you did take a DNA test.
I did. Yes. I took a DNA test. It was not how other people have done it. Basically, what I did back in the day, and this is probably 15 years ago, is I hired a private investigator to help me find information. Ultimately, what I needed to do, though, is just to take a quick step backwards. When I had my second grand mal seizure, I went to see a neurologist. And my neurologist was basically the first doctor, and by the way, the only doctor in my life up until recently, who, when I told him I was adopted, didn't just stop and move on to the next question, right? We're accustomed to doctors, when we tell them we're adopted, they say, oh, or we say, no, not available. When they ask for medical history, there's no discussion about it, which is really sad. The therapeutic response would be, oh, how do you feel about that? And that's exactly what this neurologist said. He said, how do you feel about that? And is this something we can help you with? Wow, this was miraculous to me. And ultimately what he and his staff did is they helped me to navigate the system at the state of Wisconsin, first to get my non-identifying information. And then later on, after we were not able to diagnose the cause of these grand mal seizures, to petition the courts in the state of Wisconsin to get identifying information. So I was able to obtain my entire adoption file from the state of Wisconsin and from the home for mothers, where my mother spent the last 5 months of her pregnancy and where I was born, which was incredibly informative, needless to say, immensely helpful, needless to say. And again, I'm trying to think of where to go with this because your question was such a straightforward one, but there's so much more to talk about with regard to that.
Absolutely. At what point did you have an interest in finding out what are my roots? Where did I come from?
I've always had that interest, just like David Brodzinski said. I've always been searching. Where did I come from? I had some very dear friends who would look at me and they'd say, your last name is Bohl, B-O-H-L. That was my adoptive family's name. But you're German. You just look German. You have to be. There's no doubt in any of our minds you're German. And I would tell them, I understand why you would say that, but I have no way of knowing. So I was always looking for ways to try to attach to some type of culture, to some type of heritage, but was never able to do it. It was at that time, the time that I had those seizures, I was really anxious to find out about my family, but just didn't know how to go about it. I just hadn't taken that step into a community yet. And of course, the community was not as strong a place, or maybe strong is the wrong word. They weren't in as visible a place back then in terms of DNA searches and whatnot as they are today. So I had no idea where to go, although I did know to hire a private detective, and that was my entry into that. Once I got connected with my mother's family, because paternity was not established in the records, at least in those non-identifying information. When I got the identifying information, written on one of the pages was my father's name, my birth father's name. Was that my mother's handwriting on that form? Was that a social worker's writing on that form? Was it the adoption person of the state of Wisconsin who was trying to let me know? I have no idea how it appeared there magically, but there it was. And when I pursued him and approached him, I found out that my father also had children after me, just like my mother had. And I reached out to my half-brother, I call him my brother at the time, and he was just as polite and warm and welcoming as he possibly could. But he said to me, David, I'm an attorney. Can we take a DNA test? I said, oh my gosh, I love you, right? Let's please do that. I can't think of anything better than to take a DNA test and prove some of these things that we've been putting into place. So I took a DNA test. That must have been, I don't know, probably shortly after the Corey described. I think you gave him the gift in 2010. Mine was not long after that, I'm guessing. If I'm right, if I have my facts correct, I think that's
2017. Yeah,
2017, my mistake.
Oh,
A little before that is probably 2012 or 2013. And of course, the DNA test that proved that my half-brother and I were related. We descended from the same man, and that started to open up the door and ultimately has led to all kinds of incredible relationships, but it also helped put some context into what was going on. When I think, I don't want to get ahead of here, but when I think about your podcast, you talk about these family surprises and all of these, I forgot what you described them as, but these complex truths, right? These complex, I don't know if they're hurtful or there's another word that you use, but it was so right on. And right, that one of the non-truths that I had was that my parents were irresponsible college students who didn't want to take responsibility for me. And I found out quite the opposite from people who were actually there when they went through the process of relinquishment. So my mother was one of those girls written about in the book, The Girls Who Went Away. She got pregnant. She was willing to have the baby and marry my father. He initially denied paternity. When that happened, my mother's family, who lived in Madison, got in the car with my mother and drove to my father's community about 2 hours away in the state of Wisconsin with his parents and my father and said, your son is going to take responsibility for this child. And the parents said, we can't make him do that. If he'd like to, that's up to him. And my father basically said, graduating from college in 2 weeks, they're sending me to Vietnam. What kind of father am I going to be? I might not come back. I can't make this decision now. And as all of this was going on, my aunt, who was there, and she told me this story just a few years ago, looked out into the car, in the back seat of the car, as these 5 individuals, my mother's parents, my father's parents, my father having this discussion, my mother's in the back seat of the car waiting for this to happen. So when I say relinquished or coerced, I really have a history. I know that this wasn't a decision that she made in vain or selfishly or by herself or because it only affected her. This was a decision that was made by family and, quite frankly, society. It was societal at that time to make these types of decisions, right? Because of the shame that it wreaked upon unwed mothers. So that those inconvenient, complex truths, that's one of them. And that gave me an entirely new perspective. I'm so honored and lucky to have gotten that perspective from my aunt. It gave me a whole new understanding of where my parents were coming from. Now, do I wish they had reconsidered? Do I wish we were more involved as a species? Do I wish social workers would have been more supportive? Do I wish my families would have stepped up and said, wait a minute, he's one of ours. We can raise him. Of course I do, but that wasn't the way of the time. And these were not those selfish, singular decisions I imagined them to be. So very complex. Yeah.
And you were carrying those thoughts with you for, I'm not going to guess how old you are, but decades.
63. So 4+ decades, I was carrying those very thoughts. Yes, absolutely.
Just mind-blowing.
It's not only mind-blowing, but there is not a good answer to it. So if one assumes that people had ulterior motives or ill motives, and I was the product of that, right, it's really easy to be angry. Right? Yeah. It's really easy to feel disenfranchised. It's really easy to feel victimized. And by the way, if that's the way people feel and identify, I'm not taking that away from anybody. You have the right to identify any way that you want. But to me, those are bad things because, and I really struggle with this, right? If I've learned throughout my lifetime and getting healthy, not only from substance misuse, but also from having these relinquishment experiences, I have to be okay no matter what. And certainly when you're talking to Joey and his mom, Beth, that had to be part of the discussion. And I know Beth, and I know that she has to be okay no matter what Joey does. And Joey has to be okay, even though he may not be in a position to stop or completely be abstinent. We have to be okay no matter what. Human beings have a history of not doing great things all the time. They don't always do the right thing. They don't always do the kind thing. And they're certainly not always doing things with me in mind, right? So I have to be okay no matter what. So I have to be really careful with that the law to change. I'm not expecting the state of Wisconsin to change its birth certificate rules in order to make me whole. I have to be it's the wrong thing to do that they've done, and they need to do it for other people. They need to do it because it's right, but I can't wait for them to do it to be okay. I have to be okay no matter what. Anyway, didn't want to go off on a tangent on that, but I think that's really important because ultimately what that does is it directs the power back to ourselves. We have the power to be okay. I truly believe that no matter how horrific our experiences were and how detrimental our perceptions may be, we have the ability to take that back, whether we have all the facts or not.
Right.
Absolutely.
And really within the community, while there are so many similarities, and we're just like floored every time we have a conversation with somebody, like the similarities, the differences are there too. Kendall has talked frequently about how his adoptive parents talked to him about his situation and, oh, your parents were probably really young, and just explaining things to him. So he never really carried that sort of resentment with him. But that's going to be different for everybody.
Exactly. And you're right. And it's better to the devil that you know, right? And there's still people arguing before the United States state legislature saying, oh, no, we can't give this information to these people. We can't give them information about their birth. It's going to harm them. Well, no, not knowing the truth is what harms people ultimately. By the time I went searching for my family, both of my biological parents had died. My father had died at age 46 of a brain tumor. My mother had died at age 56 of a massive heart attack brought on by her own alcohol and chemical use. These are harsh truths that I needed to know. I needed to know as part of my narrative because they help make me whole, but also needed to know them for my children and my heirs after that. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, David, how did you discover our community? And I'll say our community just because as an ally, I feel like I'm part of it. And
Absolutely.
what was it like for you to discover this community?
Well, it was really amazing, right? Back, I think the first conference I probably went to in the adoptee community was probably 2015, I'm guessing. And I had known these communities existed, but they were very geographically sparse and dispersed back at that time. And I came across an organization who at that time was called the Indiana Adoptee Network. And I also came across an organization called the American Adoption Congress. And I went to both of their conventions that year, and I was absolutely amazed to find people who thought like me, who had perceptions like mine, and who validated my experiences, right? Instead of gaslighting me and telling me, no, you're seeing it wrong, this is what happened. And they started to believe in me, right? We tell people, and I think this is a horrible message, and if it works for anybody, I hope I'm not offending anybody. I was always told, David, you have to love yourself before anyone else is going to love you. And that was horrible information for someone who could not love himself because he felt so defective, because he was given away, right? The fact of the matter is that you can let other people love you. And ultimately, that's what happened in those groups that I started going to. People showed care. They showed concern. They validated my experiences. They offered resources. They offered themselves. And I built those healthy relationships that I wasn't able to build because I was drinking all those years. And that started it. And after that time, I've gotten very involved. I was, for a time, on the board of directors of that organization. The Indiana Adoptee Network became the National Association of Adoptees and Parents. I was on their board of directors for a period of time. I'm on an organization called Wisconsin Family Community Connections here, where I work in the adoption community and stay connected in that way. The National Association of Adoptees and Parents. What would be the best word? Combine forces to collaborate with a group called Right to Know, which is about the right to know one's heritage, DNA surprises and whatnot, to do a conference. And this last time in Denver was the second time they had done the summit. I had met you and Kendall there. That's how we came into a knowledge of one another in the community, amongst many others, of course. And we see how deep and rich and robust and complex this community is, but it's something we can continue to go back to for healing. Absolutely. I also learned in the time that I started going to these combined conferences that I, too, was an MPE. Right? I had a misattributed parental event, although there's really not a name for it because it was a grandparent event. So as his brother and I started doing some DNA testing, he called me one day and he said, hey, David, I think I'm starting to understand how you're feeling, at least in a way. I said, okay, but and I chuckle and like, regale me, please. Tell me how you know how I'm thinking. And we had that relationship. It was funny. He said, I've been doing some more DNA testing, and the man that we thought was our grandfather is not our dad's father. And he was freaked about it. Right? He told me, what do we do? Well, how do we approach this? How could this happen? Again, it's another family secret that may or may not have been known even at the time. So it turns out our grandmother, who is our genetic grandmother, was 5 months pregnant when she got married. This is after we deconstructed this whole process. Turns out it was a man different than the man that my father thought was his father. My father passed away thinking that was his father, and it wasn't. And now that is requiring attention in our family. Certainly people need to know for genetic reasons. Other people need to know because they want to know who their family is. So not only have we figured out who this man wasn't genetically connected to us, we found out the man who is. And that brings the whole process in full circle, right? The whole process that one goes through when one is relinquished. Now we have an MPE, we have this DNA surprise. Now we have to go through it again. And it all starts with asking that question, okay, with this new information, Who am I? Just because I've uncovered a new truth and I've accepted it doesn't mean that I can immediately integrate it into my life and who I am. So these things, as we know, take time. They take time processing. They take individuals who can give us a perspective or check our perspectives. Is this really what I'm seeing? And there are lots of people, back to your community question, lots of people in our community have been down this road, been really helpful in this. What I've learned through that, I know this is not an optimistic message for all of those who are listening here, is this probably doesn't end. Right? It just keeps going, right? Human beings are human beings. They thought that they were taking secrets to the grave, or maybe they didn't want to know and didn't investigate them. These things are coming out through DNA, and we have to deal with them if we want to stay healthy and sane. And I say sane in a general way, not as a clinical term, but we do. And here we are dealing with it, and we're dealing with it better than we ever have been before.
Absolutely. And I think because we now have more tools than we've ever had before, we've got a larger community than we've ever had before. We have therapists and doctors who are starting to understand what people are going through. And so we definitely have resources that you didn't have as a young person. Hopefully people don't think we're coming across as like we're in a cult or anything like that. But if anything, cult you, Mark.
But I think that the most optimistic point you made there is that others are realizing they need to know this. I've had the great privilege of talking about that intersection of addiction and adoption in at least 15 different settings. I've been invited as a guest to the local medical college to talk before the class of MDs about what a doctor might need to know when a patient says they've been relinquished or adopted. There are lots of people who are now asking for this information, whereas even a few short years ago, 5 to 10 years ago, there's nothing to see here. Nothing to see here. We're okay. We like the way we're doing things. Now people are becoming more and more aware. It's kudos to you and Kendall for doing your podcast and raising awareness, and everybody else who's working in this space, including filmmakers, authors, etc. You're right. We have lots more resources and tools than we've ever had before.
For sure. Yeah. And I have to remind myself sometimes and I think it goes back to me being a journalist and naturally inquisitive and needing to know everything, that it's tough for me when I hear people say, or adoptees say, yeah, I don't have any interest in finding out about where I came from. But I have to think, and I have to equate this with, okay, just somebody from the LGBTQ community maybe isn't ready to come out of the closet, and then maybe this person is not ready to go down that path, and to give them the grace and the patience to do it on their own terms in their own time.
Absolutely. And the key word is that I would add to that statement is they're not ready today. Doesn't mean they're not ready for a lifetime. It doesn't mean they're fighting it or opposing it. They're just not in a position today to take that on for whatever reason. And there is hope there. And I can give a couple quick examples of hope. As I said, I've worked in this space between that intersection of addiction and adoption. I run a support group for people in the entire constellation who are either exposed to addiction or struggling with it themselves, have a family member, a partner, a close friend, or a colleague involved in that. And usually, or at least prior to the last few years, it takes people to be a little older, like your age, my age, before they start unpacking all of these truths. But there's hope there. We have actually had individuals call into this group, emerging adults in their teens and early 20s, asking the question that it took me into my 40s to ask, is there a connection between these two things? I had one call in from a treatment center. He was going through treatment, and it occurred to him, I wonder if that has something to do with the way I'm treating myself so unhealthily in this day and age. So the word is spreading. There are lots of things going on in our community. There's lots of awareness out there. There's lots of empowerment, ultimately, is the word that I would use, for people who want to pursue this investigation, as well as a loving embrace to help them to do that.
Yeah. And I talk about this often, but we're so appreciative to people like yourself who are brave enough to share their stories and to put the work back out there and help people in the community. And then selfishly, Kendall and I feel very fortunate that we've been able to make dozens of new friends through this podcast, yourself included. So thank you for that.
You're very kind, and thank you for doing the work, raising the awareness, telling your story, sharing, and providing a platform for others to do the same, right? It sounds almost overly altruistic, but if one person listens to one of the podcasts you do and doesn't suffer unnecessarily, like many of us did as a result, that's why we're doing it. Yeah.
David, looking forward to seeing you again in person at Summit in 2026. And thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
David, we can't thank you enough for your vulnerability and willingness to share your story with us and our listeners. Stories like yours remind us that no matter how difficult our journey, there is always hope and healing on the other side. We're so honored to be part of this community and to have the opportunity to share conversations like this. If today's episode resonated with you, or if you know someone who could benefit from hearing it, share. And as always, we encourage you to reach out with your own stories or questions. The Family Twist podcast is produced by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC, presented by Savoir Faire Marketing Communications, and features original music by Cosmic Afterthoughts.